Hey everyone, welcome to Group Text. I'm just going to start by saying this documentary has been a long time coming and because everybody was chasing for this. So, Pee-wee as himself is a new film about Paul Reubens, the creator of one of the most popular characters in TV and film, Pee-wee Herman, is arguably one of the most anticipated documentaries of the year. Already available on HBO Max streaming, the two-part show chronicles Paul Reubens' personal and professional life, warts and all. Director Matt Wolf was tasked with covering the iconic character and the man who created him, Matt Wolf. So much to talk about. Welcome to Group Text. And before we start, full disclosure, my mother and Paul Reubens were friends, so tangentially, so was I. I could not wait to watch this documentary, which was interesting because Paul / Pee-wee decided to produce it himself and picked you to direct it. And what people don't know is people have been chasing Paul for years to do this documentary. You just picked up the phone one day and it was like, hey, it's Paul Reubens. Will you direct the documentary about me?
No, not at all. Paul was my dream subject, and as you mentioned, I was not alone. And so I had made efforts to reach him several times unsuccessfully. But I didn't give up. And there was a rumor in the trade publications that the Safdie brothers were directing this kind of long rumored dark Pee-wee movie called the Pee-wee Herman story. And I knew the Safdie brothers, and I reached out and expressed, my interest in doing a documentary, but that I had had no success contacting Paul. And the rumor proved to be untrue. But then, fortuitously, Paul had been kind of communicating with someone who would become the producer of the film, Emma Tillinger-Koskoff. And Emma, advised Paul to contact the Safdies about a documentary. And when he did, they said, "Oh, we know the guy." So I was sort of made with Paul in that roundabout way. And then we proceeded to have conversations for dozens and dozens and dozens of hours during the peak of COVID lockdown. And even then, when Paul agreed to move forward, I was on like a 30-day trial period. And we ended up speaking hundreds of hours before Paul sat down in the interview chair. But it was quite the process to attempt to earn Paul's trust.
And we'll get into this about, I don't think anyone ever knew how controlling he was. We'll get into all that. What was the story you set out to tell?
I wanted to make a portrait of an artist with nuance and complexity. I wanted to show the constellation of inspirations and experiences that all collided into this iconic character, Pee-wee Herman. But I also wanted to really, delve into the separation that Paul kind of, rigorously pursued between himself and Pee-wee Herman. He was a person of competing parts. And I wanted to help him kind of bring those things together. And part of that involved Paul's decision to come out. When I approached him, he wanted to come out in the documentary. But for him, he really wanted to set the record straight about his arrests and the controversies related to them. And I always said to him, that's not my main interest in the film, and it's actually the easiest part because what happened to you was pretty undeniably wrong. So he wanted to do that. I wanted to make a portrait, and somewhere in between, we were able to capture him in his full complexity.
He did not make it easy for you.
No.
I mean, it he and again, this is all comedians, but what I discovered during the documentary was Paul didn't consider himself a comedian. He considered himself a performance artist.
Yeah, I think Paul's relationship to comedy was always one foot in the door, one foot out. He was undeniably funny. He worked in that tradition and came of age in the Groundlings when it was more of an experimental troupe rather than the sort of stepping stone pedigree that it is now. But that his background was first as a child actor in theater and then performance art at Cal Arts in the late 1970s. And I think there's a world in which Paul would have become an underground performer, but he had a kind of tenacity and unabashed ambition to be a mainstream success. So he was at once avant-garde in his sensibility and also kind of hugely mainstream in terms of his aspirations.
He was incredibly ambitious from the time he was a child. You see that. I mean, what I find fascinating is a lot of times people who go into performance art or any of the arts do have some trauma in their childhood. Paul had a very happy childhood and was out to his parents, out to his sister, was never judged by his family, only encouraged by his family to do what he wanted to do and be passionate about it. You don't find that in a lot of artists.
No, I mean, I think in artists you find nonconformists. You find people who want to define the rules on their own terms, or people who create a new language or build a world. All those things were true of what Paul aspired to do. And I actually think like people with that level of confidence and tenacity, that often does come through parental support. I think, we think about this generationally with a lot of millennials being told they're a genius by their parents, and then Gen Z not wanting to work hard. But I think for boomers like Paul, the path that he was pursuing was not the conventional path. Some parents would have said, you need to be a lawyer or a doctor. Of his kind of, milieu, kind of Jewish upper middle class kid being raised in Florida. But I think his parents had an artistic sensibility. I think that they kind of thought differently. And they were incredibly supportive. But I think Paul, because his father was a successful business owner and a sort of macho guy, I think he did feel a need to prove himself to his father, to have that sort of undeniable success, both artistically and commercially. It meant something significant to him for his father to see him as a success, which I think is a common kind of preoccupation for particularly men of his generation.
But you never watching the film feel like his father didn't acknowledge him as being a success. So we all want to prove to our parents we're a success, but there certainly was no familial pressure to prove himself.
No, but I think that people who are different, and when I say that I mean gay, I think as a gay person I can speak to it. There is a there is a sort of um
Inherent almost.
a desire to prove yourself, a desire to make your parents proud. I know I'm generalizing, but my boyfriend is a therapist and he says it's true. A lot of
Oh
gay men are
God.
overachievers. I don't think, Paul would not appreciate me saying that, but I'm saying it as myself. I think that, there's an inherent nature for people who are kind of that don't fit to carve out a hole for themselves. And Paul definitely was somebody who felt that way.
Well, Paul did not make this easy on you.
No.
And some of the stuff you left in was some of my favorite was because he was so funny, he couldn't not, and coming out of the groundlings, which was improvisational, he couldn't help himself sliding into being funny when you were asking questions and giving silly answers. Why did you choose to lead that? Because all I could feel at that point was your frustration.
You know, Paul was a rebellious and resistant subject. And while I interviewed him for over 40 hours, there was a real kind of power struggle between us. There was a competitive dynamic at play. Paul didn't necessarily want to be led, which is what I do as a director of
Right.
documentary. And initially I was frustrated, and then I realized this is portraiture. This is showing somebody in real time, in some ways wrestling with me in these barbed exchange, but really wrestling with himself and trying to contemplate how much he actually wanted to share of himself on screen. So, in a lot of ways, the film is about the past and Paul's kind of rise to fame and the challenges he faced. But I also wanted to show him in the present. In the present, he was this complex person who didn't know how to always be himself.
Yet he decided and produced the documentary. And when you sign up for that, you have to be honest. And
Mhm.
you did get to a lot of the honest parts. So take me back to the beginning for people who don't know. how did Pee-wee come to be?
Well, so Paul, like we were discussing, came out of performance art training at Cal Arts. He aspired to be an actor in the conventional sense, but wasn't having success. And then he realized that he was funny. And in the late 1970s, comedy was sort of becoming king. It wasn't yet the pathway to kind of movie stardom. It was still kind of experimental to some degree. But stand-up comedians like Robin Williams were starting to get television specials. And it was around that time that Paul was told about the Groundlings, which at the time was really just a workshop where people were playing with improvisation.
And
At the time,
it was LA's attempt to do Second City. Like it wasn't
exactly, exactly.
respected at that point.
Oh, well, it was just kind of under the radar. It was
Hmm.
people being experimental and creating something which might now be called alternative comedy, which Lorraine Newman in the film describes as really what SNL was in the beginning. So Paul was in this kind of, nucleus of experimental comedy. He was a performance artist, and right next door to the Groundlings was the premier punk record store of Los Angeles. It was called Vinyl Fetish. And Paul kind of became attracted to the sensibility of punk and also artists who were working in that scene. And so, kind of by chance and by accident through improvisation, he came up with the character Pee-wee, and people really responded to it. But after he was rejected from SNL in an early audition, he decided to sort of take matters into his own hands and he put on a midnight theater production. And that theater production really brought together his collaborators at the Groundlings and also the artists and the punk scene. And it all kind of got mashed up into the world that would become ultimately Pee-wee's Playhouse and his children's television series. And it was a launching pad for Paul to become a crossover star.
I remember. So it was started out as these midnight performances, then it went to the Groundlings, and then the big, real first conventional step was doing a series of performances at the Roxy.
Yeah,
Now, what year was that?
God.
There's a
I
reason I'm
think
asking you that.
I think it was either 82 or 83. It was in the early 80s.
So my parents took me to one of
Wow.
the, yeah. So I'm not sure it's because they wanted me to understand or knew that it was this new thing that I should be exposed to, or just kind of a why not or not great parenting. I'm not really
Or
100%
maybe
sure.
it was kind of billed to them as like a kind of alternative children's show.
I don't know, but I literally, and I was trying to remember the year, and I'm like, wow, I was really young. But
Yeah, I
even
know.
then, I knew it was funny,
Hmm.
but I had a very
And that was
different sense
part
of
of the
humor.
that was part of the magic of Pee-wee is that, particularly with the children's show, but always, I think the character kind of really tapped into the essence of children, like their brattiness and their sweetness, but also the mischievousness of the character always gave a wink to the adults. So it was that rare character that appealed, like Rocky and Bullwinkle to some extent, to both adults and children.
No, The Simpsons and all, I mean, all
Yeah.
these shows that have followed South Park. Um, he was never ashamed in a way in his personal life that he was gay. You never got the feeling that he was ashamed. And that's really where you started to see this split personality. Because suddenly Pee Wee had to go the conventional route, yet it was something that intrinsically Paul fought against. Got the manager. They said, you need to do a tour. You need to prove you can get asses in the seats. Culminated in playing the Universal Amphitheater, which no longer exists, and had to prove to the industry that he could do this, which is diametrically opposed to what he actually believed in as an artist. How did he start to separate and realize you had to be commercial, yet you could still remain true to yourself and understand this character is really a wink?
I don't think there was a blueprint for that because what Paul did was pretty unprecedented. I think there were Andy Kaufmans out there, but what Paul wanted was a certain kind of crossover that was beyond what someone like Andy Kaufman, who really was truly kind of a performance artist working in the space of comedy. Paul was doing something that hadn't been done before, and it came with great personal sacrifice. So when he decided to go back into the closet very early in his career, he was doing that so that he could focus on his aspirations as an artist. And in some ways, I see it as a survival strategy. He wouldn't have been able to pull off what he did as an openly gay person, but I do think that Paul did grapple with shame and that he was somebody who had to compartmentalize an aspect of himself and then would go on to create a character that he very, very rigorously separated from himself. And the two things were not unrelated, in my view.
Because it really was living two separate lives. And I don't feel like he went back into the closet, from my point of view, is just he didn't share it. He didn't try and actively dispel it, I think is what I'm trying to say. He wasn't being seen out on the town with women and this. There literally was nothing. I mean, granted, we also lived in a very different time where we didn't have this paparazzi and the 24-hour news cycle and the TMZs and all that and Daily Mail. But he really did not exist publicly as Paul.
Yeah.
I mean, and that had to be terribly insulating. Do you think that affected why he became even more controlling during the filming of the show, the kids show?
I think I think that was insulating, but it also was liberating because Paul was able to enjoy anonymity but still be a celebrity as Pee-wee. And I think creating that level of separation that is a controlling thing. And I think being controlling was Paul's nature. It's also true of many great artists. Like you make great work because you control it in very precise ways. But I think that Paul really experienced that separation backfiring when he was arrested, and his mugshot was the first time Paul Reubens was really introduced to the public through tabloids. So Paul also today, as an older person, carried trauma with him from his arrests and from that loss of control that he experienced in the media. So I think it was inherent to his character. It was part of the result of being a very successful artist, but it also was a function of trauma that he experienced when that separation he created collapsed.
One of the things I did not know was that he was the one who gave Tim Burton his first big feature. And when you go back and look at it, and I did not know it was Tim Burton, and when you go back and look at the film and you think about it, it is incredibly Tim Burton,
Yeah. Yeah, and Tim Burton was 26 years old.
which is insane. I mean, it was all right there. And he does the second movie. Why did he not go with Tim for the final movie, the circus movie he always wanted to make that didn't work?
I don't know. I can't speak to that. But I knew that with that movie, Paul very much wanted to have a different level of control as a producer, not unlike the experience that I was having. He
Right.
chose a director, Randall Kleiser, who was very successful. He had made
Hmm.
Grease, but Randall had agreed to let Paul be very involved in the production of the film in a way that was very different than Big Adventure. Big Adventure, I think, was that kind of first film kismet that you hear about, where people don't know what they're doing, they have zero expectations, and magic happens. When he made Big Top, he was a big success. He had a lot of power, and I think that power and the control that came with it, you know, resulted in Paul to some extent self-sabotaging. So I don't know why Tim didn't do that second film, but I know that what Paul wanted creatively was more comprehensive than what he had in his initial film.
Because the film really, from the point of view that you show it, makes no sense. We did not want to see Pee Wee be romantic.
Hmm.
And he had such a grasp on who Pee Wee was and who the audience responded to. Why did he not only decide to do it, but think it was going to work? Because he really hadn't had any misses.
I don't know. I think we all miscalculate, that we all kind of move through the world taking risks if we're creative people or if we're public personalities who want to express something. We all take risks and sometimes that doesn't work out. And it was extraordinary how much had worked out for Paul and for Pee-wee leading up to that film. And I think in some respects it was a healthy experience for him as an artist to understand that he was not infallible. And for me as a filmmaker, it felt like a kind of a lesson about control. That control had, to some extent, really served Paul, but it might also be to his detriment. And that was foreshadowing, in a sense, the loss of control he experienced when he was arrested.
Yeah. So the arrest, my biggest question is, first of all, I remember it happening and everybody being devastated and the shock of the public to what Paul looked like. And he got caught in a sting. But I turned to my husband last night and I said, what do people think goes on in an X-rated theater? Like, this should not have been a shock.
Well, the other thing that's missed is that Paul said to me, and he said publicly at the time, that he didn't do what he was accused of doing by the Vice
Right.
Squad, that kind of raided that theater. He was just there. And I believe him. He had no
Yeah.
reason to tell me not the truth on that. It's old ancient history. But it was, it seems provincial now, what he
Very.
was accused of. But it was in the early days of the media's growing appetite for salacious takedowns. And Paul fell prey to that for sure. He was an early casualty.
And also how he looked. It could
Yeah,
not have been more
I think
diametrically
that's
opposed
why.
to Pee-wee. It was not
Yeah.
clean cut. It was who Paul was. It was, I don't want to use the word hippie, but it was artist look. The
Well,
long
and
hair, the
that
glasses.
like Charles Manson mugshot. I mean,
Yeah.
it was for people who knew Pee-wee as this sweet kind of character, it was a kind of scary iteration of their childhood hero, and I think that that was really devastating for Paul. If Paul were to kind of come out as himself in the media publicly, it would have been a very different version of events and of self-presentation.
Do you think that was a miscalculation by him to not come out earlier? Officially come out?
No, I think Paul suffered something really unfair and that it was random and that it was out of his control and he had to deal with the consequences of this horrible thing that happened to him.
And they decided to take a plea deal
Yeah.
rather than fight it.
Yeah, I mean
I
it
mean,
was a
no contest.
it was a misdemeanor for indecent exposure. It was such a minor thing, but had kind of escalated to be such an enormous media scandal. It was, I think, when public figures endure that kind of scrutiny, it's better for it to go away than to kind of be humiliated further in public.
Yet he managed to come back.
Yeah, he was super resilient. He definitely was traumatized by it and retreated in a reclusive way, but he put himself out there. He had to kind of reimagine his career and had a lot of success as a character actor. And I think people recognize the full scope of his talent and creativity. And he was somebody who was very determined to make work. He wasn't going to just cry a river and live by himself and never talk to anybody again.
He didn't bring himself back, so to speak. He managed to bring Pee-wee back and
Mhm.
create even more separation. How much of a toll did that take on his personal life?
I don't think Pee-wee took a toll on his personal life. I think that the media scandals affected him in a long-term way. I think they were traumatic. But I think Pee-wee was something he loved, but even more so, I think he understood intrinsically what Pee-wee meant to other people because he got that feedback. And I think he in some ways wanted to be, as he says in the film, a vessel to bring people the feelings that Pee-wee brought up for them, which were very, very powerful feelings, which I'm learning as this film is coming out and other people tell me about their relationship to his character. So I don't think I don't think Paul ever had a really fraught relationship to Pee-wee. I think he had a fraught relationship to the media scandals that he endured.
My mother was very good friends with Barry Humphries,
Mhm.
who was Dame Edna and all these different characters. But Barry was known, at least in England, also as Barry Humphries.
Yeah.
and not just Dame Edna. People knew what they were getting. Why didn't Paul ever feel confident enough that he could say, okay, especially after the MTV comeback, this is a character. Why did he? The only person who seemed to make him comfortable to be himself out in public was Debbie Mazar.
Yeah, she really was a she is a remarkable person. I've loved getting to know her a bit, and
Oh, she's
I
fantastic.
yeah, she was an incredible friend and ally to Paul. And Paul did put himself out there as Paul. He appeared on talk shows as himself, but I don't think that was his goal or desire. I think his goal or desire was to work. He was somebody who thrived when he was working. I think Debbie saw that in him, that if this creative person doesn't get it together and put himself out there and work, he's going to perish. And I think her, as well as a circle of friends, including Prudence Fenton and Allie Willis and Mark
Yeah.
Ballett and others, I think they all kind of helped Paul come out of the shock, really, of his rest at that time.
You show the Leno hit when he finally came out as Paul. And the funniest thing was that he brought cards.
Yeah.
And I felt like that was, and I don't mean this in a disrespectful way to Leno. Leno didn't play along enough. Like
Yeah.
that was the wrong place to do it. It could have been so hilariously funny. And I felt like Leno didn't know what to do with it.
It was a little awkward. And that's the kind of stuff I encountered as well, as Paul had ideas in his head about how he would present himself, but they were weird ideas. And he was resistant and he was uncomfortable, but also kind of savvy and mischievous and funny. And I think that was a perfect example of him, grappling with both a kind of really an ambivalence with coming out as himself. And I don't think that was something Paul really aspired to. I think it's something he needed to do in order to regain visibility and momentum for a professional life in the entertainment industry.
See, I was watching that, and from my perspective, I'm like, oh my God, if he had done that on Letterman, oh my God, if he had done that
Yeah,
on Conan,
yeah,
you know, or if now he had done that on like Fallon,
yeah,
it
yeah,
would
yeah.
have been so funny.
Yeah, 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 yeah. And those are all people who are huge,
Huge
huge.
peeps. I mean, Letterman gave him a huge break.
Yeah, and Conan is just such a champion of Paul's work at the time when Paul was alive, and now that Paul's passed. And yeah, he's an icon to that generation of comedians, and he really got his name on Letterman when Letterman was just making his name as well. And your mother as well in her talk show. These were opportunities for Paul to bring Pee-wee out into the wild. It was a different kind of experiment and improvisation being on those shows, and yeah, I think Paul was always trying to figure out how to do what served his character and his work best, whether it was as Pee-wee or during this moment of playing character actors as himself.
Which was very exciting because he was very talented. I mean, to this day, one of my favorite scenes in any movie was his death scene in Buffy the
Oh my God, so
Vampire.
good, so good.
And he was just gaining momentum as Paul, as an actor.
Yeah,
And then it all comes falling down again,
yeah, yeah.
where he got caught up in another scandal and they ended up raiding his house looking for child pornography, of which he had none. He had vintage homosexual art.
Correct.
And that really was a huge blow to him because his collecting was such a big part of his personal persona and his privacy.
Yeah, you put it perfectly. That's all true.
What I found amazing was he was friends with Doris Duke. Like all of a sudden, Doris Duke shows up in the movie,
Yeah.
but that they had to literally smuggle him out of Florida to New Jersey.
Yeah, that was during the first arrest. I think during the second investigation and that whole saga, Paul was really targeted. And in that case, it really did seem to me, going into the project, like a homophobic witch hunt. And I think I made a lot of efforts to go in depth into that issue to really show the facts as they're presented in the film. And it feels clear to me that he was just incredibly wronged by law enforcement.
But that one I felt like was so personally devastating to him because
Oh,
he couldn't hide behind Pee-wee. This
no,
was
and also
targeted at Paul.
yes, and also the accusation of child pornography possession is so damaging. You know, the damage is already done once the accusation is made, regardless of the kind of innocence of the person who is accused. And that is something that Paul carried with him, for sure.
He went to a really dark place after that.
Yeah, but I think he had to just do work on himself. I think again, though, he put himself out there, which is just so extraordinary to me. I would not have the resilience to do that, I don't think. I wouldn't want to be a celebrity and put myself out there in general, but I think that for somebody who does have that desire, that would have beaten most people down. But Paul kept putting himself out there. I think because, again, he knew that if he wasn't working, he would languish. He would not be able to be a person in the world with confidence and pride and dignity. And he picked himself up.
I understand that whole mentality because, especially because of my mother. Paul decided not to sit for the last interview.
Hmm.
You did 40 hours. Decided not to do the last interview. What had happened between the two of you that he decided he wasn't going to do it?
Throughout the entire process, there was a tug of war and a power struggle between us. I did not want to do a hit piece, but I also didn't want to do a puff piece. And Paul and I had a lot in common. I'm used to getting my way as a director, and he was a celebrity who was highly controlling and did not like the answer no. And that came to a head, particularly as we were starting post-production, because I think Paul rightfully recognized that documentaries are made in the edit, and he didn't have the assurance that he would have the level of control that he wanted. And it put the project in turmoil. There was uh, we weren't able to move forward, and we're kind of at an impasse. But I heard from Paul finally that he was ready to proceed. And we had a final conversation in anticipation of completing his interviews, which would go more in depth into his arrests and to reflect on the experience of being the subject of a documentary film. And in that conversation, I could tell something was wrong. Um, and he said a lot of meaningful things to me that gave me the assurances I needed to proceed with the project. But something was off. And I was en route to go to LA to film that interview when I found out on Instagram that he had died. I had no idea that he had been sick with cancer in the time that I had worked with him.
What's fascinating to me is he had had cancer for 6 years. You spend so much time with people doing a documentary, and he kept it from everyone. It was like his last secret.
Yeah, yeah.
But then you find out that he has made a videotape.
Audio. He recorded
Audio,
audio.
audio. I mean, you see him walking around or someone walking around with the camera.
I put that video
Oh,
there, but he
okay.
recorded audio.
Okay. Good to know. Love the honesty. Um, how did you find out about the audio tape? Who said to you, you
Well,
need
Paul,
this?
I found out on Instagram that Paul died. My
It's how we
phone,
all found out, which was,
yeah,
I was like,
mind-boggling.
what?
I was in total shock, and I got a call from Paul's publicist and good friend, Kelly Bush Novak. She had been trying to reach me before the news broke, but she didn't make it in time. And she said, Paul recorded something for you the night before he died. And I just was in total shock. And I flew to LA and went to her office and listened to it. And it was devastating. But Paul had things he wanted to get off his chest in the documentary, but he ran out of time.
So Paul passes away. You now have this audio tape. You start every episode with a card saying, hey, we did 40 hours. We never knew he had cancer and he passed away. Why did you feel like you needed to share that we never were able to get the last interview? Because you could have cut it in a way that just flowed into that. I mean, his sudden death, not really sudden to anyone else, but sudden death to the public. Did you have to go back into the re-edit and make that decision to share that he never told anyone.
Yeah, I mean, this film was, like I said, heavily about the past in Paul's career, but also significantly about the present. And the fact that Paul, you know, was very ambivalent and struggling to tell his story. And I think part of that was his resistance and fear of talking about the arrest and revisiting the darkest and most challenging parts of his story. And, that was at the center of his issues around control and his anxiety about having his story told by somebody else as opposed to himself. And so I thought it was important to show that struggle that he had, both with me, kind of on camera, but also internally. And he did address it in the audio he recorded for me. He made that audio for the documentary. And I felt both a responsibility and a need to use it so that he could address these things himself.
It is such an amazing story. I mean, for me personally, when you showed him doing the birthday thing, it made me really
Yeah.
sad because it made me remember I don't get those anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. It is sad.
It is such a wonderful documentary. Everybody needs to watch it. It is fascinating watching sort of the behind the scenes of a true performance artist and also getting to watch the rise of an iconic character and the toll it took on the man behind it. Matt, well, thank you so much. Pee-wee as himself, a 2-part documentary already streaming on HBO Max. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was a great
Oh,
conversation. I appreciate all the anecdotes from your memories as a
oh,
kid, and so fascinating to know your parents took you to the Roxy's. So
like I
cool.
said, not sure. In hindsight, maybe not a great parenting decision.
Yeah, but pretty cool.